Well, good morning, church. It is good to be with you, whether you are here in the sanctuary, whether you are joining us online, whether you're listening on the radio at KTCU. It is good for us to be together, wherever we may be, and to worship God as one. So we are in the midst of a series that we are calling Bible Stories for Grown-Ups. And we're looking at some of the stories that maybe we were taught early on, but trying to look at them through a different lens, a more mature lens, to see what they might have for us today. Now, I need to tell you right up front that this idea for this series was not mine alone, that it comes from a book by Josh Scott, who is a pastor in Nashville. And last week, you may remember, if you were here, we looked at the story of Noah and the great flood and discovered what it had to say to us today. And today, we're going to look at one of the most revered, but also one of the most troubling stories in Scripture. And that is the story of the binding of Isaac. If you'll allow me a moment of honesty and a moment of vulnerability, let me just tell you, I hated this story as a child. I hated this story. I didn't even want to finish reading it to the end. I didn't even want to know how it turned out. But alas, there it is. It's right there in the Bible, Genesis chapter 22. So what do we do with this story? We'd much prefer just to skip it and pretend it's not there, but it's there. So what do we do with this story? As you prepare to hear it, I would invite you to remember that this is the story of a father, a guy by the name of Abraham, who had been made some promises by God that his descendants would outnumber the stars in the sky. The problem is that this particular guy happened to be 100 years old at the time and had no children. Now, a lot happens between there and how we get to our story this morning, but eventually he has a son by the name of Isaac. And all of the promises that were made to Abraham rest on this particular human, Isaac. Rest on him growing up and having kids, expanding their family, doing all the things. Now, this same man, Abraham, in the not too distant past, had heard a voice. He was known as Abram at the time, and the voice came to him and said, I want you to pack up and to go from your father's house, to leave everything that is familiar, and to go to the land that I will show you. He was not given directions. He was not given an address. There was no iPhone where he could punch in Waze to see what was the quickest way with least traffic. None of that. God was essentially saying to him, you're not going to know where you're going, but you'll know when you get there. And miraculously, perhaps, he does it. He packs up and he goes and he leaves everything, believing in that promise, the promise that was made to him by God, that promise would come true. And now, where we pick up the story, all of the twists and turns that lay in this story, the births of sons, the new name, more than a couple bad decisions, all occur because of the trust that he has placed in that voice that called him to leave the familiar and to embark on a journey into mystery and to the land that I will show you. And it's important for us to remember that all along he has been faithful to that call that is placed upon his life. And then the voice comes back. And I invite you to hear that story now from Genesis chapter 22.
Here begins the reading. After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham? And he said, Here I am. He said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the two of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father Abraham, "Father?" And he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where's the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So the two of them walked on together. When they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac, laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide," as it is said to this day. "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will indeed bless you, and I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gates of their enemies. And by your offspring shall all the nations of the earth gain blessing for themselves, because you have obeyed my voice." So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. Here ends the reading, the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
So I know what you're thinking, and I'm just going to say it before any of you do, that the story of the binding of Isaac is a bold choice for Mother's Day. Here's what you need to know about that, is that I oftentimes plan out my sermon series, oftentimes up to a year in advance. I have everything mapped out for the rest of this year. And several months ago, when I was preparing that map, that schedule, I didn't quite make the connection that this story would fall on this day. So my bad, not a good decision on my part on that. Didn't think that one through. This story, it raises all sorts of questions, but I am willing to guess that one thing is sure this morning, and that is that all the moms that are there this morning, that are here, are thinking, this wouldn't have happened if Sarah was watching Isaac. This is a complicated story. Let me pause for just a moment and say, too, about Mother's Day, that as beautiful of a day as it is, and as much as I'm looking forward to talking to my mom and calling her and celebrating my beautiful wife, Kelly, who was an amazing mother to our 4 kids, I am very much aware that for some, this is a complicated day. As Allison prayed a moment ago, for some of us whose relationship is not what we needed it to be, or didn't know their mom, those that have lost a mom or lost a child, those who desperately want to be a mom but are grieving loss or distance. No matter where you are, we want you to know that we see you and that we love you and that we remind you that mothering is not solely an act of biology. And so hope that you will celebrate all of those who have mothered you in some way, shape, or form. It's a complicated day. And like it, it's a complicated story. Here's Abraham, who's been faithful, who's been called by God once again to take his son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a sacrifice to me, God says. It is this dramatic turn in the story. The tension builds as God says this. And the narrator says it, did you notice, without a lot of emotion, but just sort of matter-of-factly. One thing that is interesting to know, perhaps, is that in the original Hebrew, it sounds a little bit different because the name Isaac appears at the end of that sentence, not at the beginning. And so it would sound more like this: take your son, your only son, the one whom you love, Isaac. Take him and sacrifice him to me. There is debates among rabbis and scholars about what might have been going on in between those phrases, reading between the lines. Was Abraham pushing back? Like, take your son, your own. I don't know who you're talking about. No, your only son. Well, which son? Until finally God says, this one. This one, the one you love, take him to a place I will show you and sacrifice him to me. And once again, just like before, Abraham obeys. And he does what he's told, and he gets up in the morning and he saddles his donkey and he cuts the wood and he grabs Isaac and a couple of servants and they head out. Now, I got to tell you that I hated this story as a child, and even now as a parent, I have to admit that his response is flabbergasting to me. Completely, I just don't get it. I just don't understand, because he doesn't, at least in the text that we hear, he doesn't question, he doesn't resist, he doesn't argue, he doesn't ask God, beg God to reconsider. Just like when he was told to leave his father's house, he just goes. And maybe one of the most gut-wrenching details is that Isaac unwittingly plays a role in his own horror story. Did you notice how the narrator of the story, once again, without any emotion, just sort of matter-of-factly tells that Isaac participated in this? That Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. And Isaac himself, he carried the fire and the knife, and together they went up to the mountain. At one point, Isaac even asks his dad, so Dad, we've got this wood, we've got this fire, we've got this knife, but I don't see the lamb. Where's the animal that we are to sacrifice? And I don't know about you, but as the story was going on, there was a part of me that wanted to scream out, Isaac, it's you. Don't go. Sort of like watching a horror movie when people hear a noise outside and they go out alone to check it out, when all of the audience knows that outside there's a person with a hockey mask waiting to kill this person. But the only problem is that this isn't a horror movie. It's a Bible story. Well, you heard what happens next, that Abraham builds the altar, places the wood on it, and then binds up his son and places him on that, and he picks up the knife, and as he's about to do the unthinkable, because this is what God told him to do, as he's about to do the unthinkable, suddenly, thankfully, there is another voice. An angel of the Lord calls out to him, telling him not to do it. And in that moment, he looks over to the side and he sees there a ram that has been caught in the thicket. And much to our relief, Abraham sacrifices the ram instead of Isaac. So I ask us again, what do we do with this story? What does this story say about God? What does this story say about Isaac? What does this story, what does this experience do to Isaac? Well, I can tell you one thing. Isaac never went camping with his father again. Like I said, it raises all sorts of different questions. It's complicated. Now, there are traditionally a few different interpretations and understandings of what this story meant, and one of the most standard interpretation, and one that I would encourage us to not agree to just turn away from, to not jump to. And that is, it comes from more fundamentalist evangelical Christians. And that is that this story is just a foreshadowing to the Jesus story. That Jesus was the ram in the thicket. That humans were in trouble, and rather than God sacrificing the humans, as we heard last week, that instead God sacrificed Jesus instead of humanity. But that doesn't help us understand and to know how our Jewish brothers and sisters would understand this story. And that's not being faithful to our heritage, our religious and spiritual heritage. You see, I would argue that it's important for us to hear these stories in the Old Testament within the context, within the meanings of the communities that wrote and received them. It's important for us to engage it as a story of Abraham and Isaac and what our spiritual ancestors might be challenging us to see today. Another interpretation, understanding of this story, which I remember being taught as a child, is that we should just be like Abraham. That we should just be like Abraham, willing to sacrifice whatever God calls us to do in order to be faithful. And if we do what God asks without questioning, if we do what God asks, then God will bless us richly as a result. But I would argue that interpretation, that understanding, it minimizes the trauma of this story. That it ignores the human experience. Not only that, but perhaps most importantly, it creates images of God that are problematic, to say the very least. Because what kind of a God needs a person to prove themselves, to prove their loyalty? What kind of a God tests us that would even think of demanding the sacrifice of a child? Well, I can tell you this, that's not a God that I would want to worship or serve. You know, a lot of us in the church know enough to say that God doesn't test us, life tests us. That if you're going to live in this world, you're going to be tested. And I know that to be true. Last week was final exams across the street at TCU. And there were a lot of tests that were given. But have you ever noticed that the difference between being a student and being in the real world is that when you're a student, you learn the lessons and then get tested. But in life, it seems you get tested and then somewhere along the way, you learn the lesson. God doesn't test us. Life tests us. And I think it's important, too, that we not let Abraham off the hook too quickly either. I mean, what kind of a father is commanded to sacrifice his child and just does it without any resistance, without even protest? Does that mean, as sons and daughters of Abraham, that we are just to follow blindly? That we're just supposed to do whatever we're told by God to do, to not question, to not doubt, nothing. Even when it goes against everything we know to be true, everything that we trust, everything that we sense in our gut. Is that what it means to be faithful? You know, when our kids get old enough to go out into the world, whether high school, college, whatever, when we send them out into the world, we always tell them, don't you, that if you ever find yourself in a situation and your intuition, your gut, tells you that this is wrong, it's wrong. You need to pay attention to that. If something feels wrong, it probably is. So, is there a way for us to engage this story that actually gives us a better understanding of God and what it means to be a person of faith? Now, there is something in this story that we can begin to see, and I want to start by saying that it's hard to see, especially in English, if we haven't been trained how to see. Here's what I mean by that. Scholars, biblical scholars, have this belief, this understanding. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's not some wild, it's widely accepted and believed that in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, the first 5 books, which make up the Torah, are put together by at least 4 different sources. Sort of like in the same way that in the New Testament, we have the 4 different Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But each of those are a different book in and of itself, written by a different person to a different audience for a different purpose. But in the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, we have these same types of sources, people that were writing, but rather than each writing their own story, they would take the story and they would edit and add along the way. Does that make sense? They would edit and add, and so we have this one story that's got 4 different voices and resources along the way. And the reason that that's important is because along the way, the voices change in the midst of this story. Part of the way that we know that the different sources are speaking in each different point is that because these different sources use different names to identify God. At the beginning of the story, there is one source who refers to God as, well, God. The word in Hebrew is Elohim. But later in the story, God is not called God, Elohim. God is called Yahweh, which is a more personal name for God. And what becomes clear in Hebrew, but is sometimes a little hard to see in English, is that in the story, it's God, Elohim, that tells Abraham to go to the mountain. But when he's about to plunge the knife, it is Yahweh's voice that calls him away. So what many scholars say that we are to see in this story is that, yes, this is a mashup of these different sources, but it is, at least for Abraham, this moment of growth, this moment of transformation. And yes, he has left behind everything that is familiar. And yet, notice that he doesn't flinch when the voice of Elohim tells him to sacrifice his son. But Abraham is coming from a place where that is a normal ask, where you follow blindly, that you don't ask questions, that you don't doubt, you don't question, that doubts and questions are seen as the opposite of faith, that the gods ask for that sort of thing. But in this story, we see the God that Abraham would come to know saying that if you want this journey, that if you want this experience, if you want this transformation that it will bring, if you want to change the world in the way that I am asking you to change the world, then you need to grow. You need to let go of some of the images, some of the understandings of God that have brought you to this point, and to embrace a God who does not demand things from you, but a God who generously and compassionately provides for you. You see, I think for a lot of us, the understandings, the images of God that we were given no longer serve us well. They are no longer leading us to the wholeness that the love of God and grace longs for us to know, to trust. That those understandings, those images of God are no longer leading us to become the best versions of ourselves. And I know that it can be hard to let go of some of those things that we are taught, that we are given, that we just sort of absorb about who God is, about what it means to be a person of faith. On Monday night of this last week, we had a UCC and U event. It's an event that we have every couple of months for folks that are interested in learning more about University Christian Church or what it means to make this their church home. And when it was all done, there was a woman that came up and introduced herself to me at the end and wanted to tell me how thankful she is for this community of faith. What a blessing it has been in her life. She explained to me that she was raised in a more fundamentalist more evangelical tradition. And the things that she had been taught about God, they just no longer fit. Sort of like trying to put on a jacket that's 8 sizes too small. And here she is, coming to a place like this where she is encountering a God that is loving and kind, where it's okay to bring questions and doubts and the sense of curiosity. And it is for her like the first breath of air after coming up from underwater. She did go on to tell me, it's hard though, you need to know. It's hard, and sometimes, occasionally, something will happen, somebody will say something, and I resort back to those old images and those understandings that I was given way back when. And in that moment, I have to remember. I have to pause and take a breath and remember that God is more expansive, that God is more compassionate, that God is more inclusive than I was taught. You see, church, here's what I know to be true. And that God meets us where we are, but then invites us to step forward. It's what Rob Bell refers to as the divine pull, that God is constantly pulling us forward into new ways of seeing, new ways of being. I can tell you that in my life, in the 5+ decades that I've been alive, that God, my understanding, my images of God have changed dramatically. And my hope and my prayer is that will continue as I continue to grow and to learn. And my hope and my prayer is that your understandings and your images of God have grown along the way and that they will continue to grow. That this is a story of awakening, of invitation to leave behind those old images of God in order to embrace a better one. You see, church, that's still our journey. That's still the work that we are to be about, that we haven't yet arrived. But my hope is that in stories like this, read through a more grown-up, a more mature lens, will encourage us to continue on that journey, to pursue that trajectory into the wholeness that God intends for our lives. And let me close with this. I still don't like the story. I still don't like the story. I don't know anybody who does. But because of the tradition of a place like University Christian Church, where we are invited to question and to doubt and to grow, to not just follow blindly, but to ask hard questions, that I can come to understand, to appreciate it, and to see something that it has for me today and going forward. Amen? Amen.